What is violence? How are we to respond to violence? We live in a modern world. I think we all agree that we live in a modern world. A world that, therefore, is not the first world. We have a First World War, but it's not the first war. And there is something novel about the modern world we live in. You say, well, does this matter? Do we not know that everything that came before the modern was stained and unacceptable, and that we have progressed beyond it? But there's something about the way we have advanced that is sometimes, if not altogether ignored, at any rate underestimated. We are familiar with the advances of technology, but we seldom are familiar with, or at any rate, acknowledge that technology is not just tools, but a way of life. And that way of life entails the quest for what we could call mechanical solutions to problems conceived mechanistically. This is to say that we have a superficial approach to problems. We quantify, and although we leave ourselves open to the enjoyment of qualities, so we speak about having quality time in our lives, our enjoyment of life is secured for us. This is our usual perception of things, by our addressing quantities. So, for instance, we might say that we have to go earn money so that we may then go out and spend it on quality time. So, earning requires bracketing of the spending, clearly. The problems that we have are addressed by focusing on what we call practical solutions, in the sense of the term realpolitik. That is to say, by focusing on matters that are studied by our sciences. Now, when we treat problems this way, or mechanistically, seeking mechanical answers to them, we are departing from the general gist of the pre-modern world. Now, very often we look down upon it and say that, well, the pre-modern world had wars of religion, so tribalism in effect. And we are moving past it by guaranteeing peace through economic relations, and these are bound necessarily to the development of modern science. So modern science / technology is helping us attain world peace. It is true that we still have objections to the rise of world peace. Here and there we have despots, we have stubborn regimes. But what else can we do other than strive to establish this world peace, this new world order? And so we admit that there are sacrifices to be made in the name of that world order. And these sacrifices include the requirements of war against all objectors, all objectors. So we are all working in this respect within this, which we could call a great machine, the machine of progress. A machine that leaves out an older way of life. This older way of life, however, is not well understood in merely tribal terms, for indeed, we need not look farther than the Bible to see that there is a reaction against tribalism, although it is not a reaction that is relying on a machine. By that I don't mean that the ancients did not have hammers. It just means that they did not use hammers to define the problems they had. Whereas in the modern world, we find that problems are defined by the machine, and problems become the machine themselves. They become the consummate machine. And we approach problems, of course, as that machine in a mechanical way. Well, the ancients did not have that response to the fundamental problems, the permanent problems that we all share. They had either tribal response or something like the biblical response, which meant looking beyond the tribal, opening up the tribal. Now, the biblical response is not really essentially sui generis. It is not, a one of a kind out of the blue. It is an eminent, we could even say representation of a classical poetic response. And the poetic response amounts to what? It amounts to opening up the tribal attitude and thus tribal violence to its ground. What does it mean to open up the tribal way of life to its ground? It means to educate people. It means to turn all of our exclamation marks into question marks. So instead of me fighting against you, we have a situation where you're no longer the enemy. The enemy is the condition in which we are set, in which we are determined as enemies to each other. This condition, now you could say, well, it's a matter of the fall, recognition of the great fall of man, of Adam and Eve. You can state this in various ways. The ancients don't give us the scientific account of everything. They give us various accounts. Some of them make more sense, some of them are more enlightening than others. Now, when we open up our vision, our conduct, our way of relating to each other, to this problem that we are in the same machine, and that in fighting against each other, we're simply responding passively. We're being compelled, in other words, by the machine. We're responding passively to the biddings of the machine. Well, do we stop fighting? Perhaps we need to keep fighting. But we don't fight in a barbaric way. Now, the question of fighting is opened up to the question of the foundations. So, once we conceive the theater, the battlefield, in mechanistic terms, and say, well, why don't we establish a universal field, a universal battlefield? And when it's universal, nobody's going to be fighting anymore, because you see that there is no enemy outside, but we're all in it together. And sure, there's going to be disagreements, but they're going to be technical disagreements that the battlefield itself, conceived as a machine, will be able to address and solve as these difficulties arise. Well, once that is done, can that be done? But when that is done, then the big question is, well, where is the human being? The human being has turned into a machine who responds mechanically to the demands of the great machine. The battlefield is a machine. Now, for the pre-modern world, so outside of this paradigm, this modern paradigm, the battlefield is not a machine. It is a place where there can be the disclosure of the ground. So it turns out that this battlefield is a corruption of what we could call an ethical garden, a garden of genuine human relationships and relations. So we have education, poetry, which is very important, is of paramount importance, because it helps restore this garden, this original garden. It helps restore human relations. It helps restore us to our humanity, so that we are no longer left bickering against each other within the machine. How do we do this, by the way, today? Well, you have the established position, the raison d'etat, ragion di Stato, the reason of state, right? The dominant position, and then we have the regime's position, and then we have the opposition. So whatever the establishment says, it says to favor general order. Whatever the opposition says is to represent all that is left out of the general order, the dissatisfaction with that imposition of the general order. And we have this all over the place, and it takes various shapes, forms, colors, and everybody's fighting in the mechanical world vehemently, trying to assert one position against the other. So we have the despots on top, and then you have the voice of the people on the bottom, and the two are at odds with each other necessarily. Now, when conceived mechanically, these two poles work hand in hand. One is establishing the great machine. The other one is responding mechanically to the inadequacies of the machine as it stands. So it's actually fueling, propelling the machine to take into account the objections. And when it does so, the machine develops further and engulfs all of the objections in the long run. So the mechanical objections to the great machine make the machine even greater. And so they're working towards the establishment of this universal machine. This is what happens when you respond to problems mechanically. You feed into the mechanisms of the machine. So you fuel the great machine. So the ancients have this fantastic response to that. And they say, well, what can you do to avoid feeding into the machine? What can you avoid at this stage? Can you avoid violence? Can we avoid violence? And the answer for the ancients is yes. But how can you avoid violence? Now, for the great modern prophets of modernity, from Machiavelli to Hegel, violence is necessary. Evil is necessary for the development of the universal peace. The only way we can escape violence is by opening up the stage of diatribe to its foundation. But here's the problem. In the modern world, we have banned that. I mean, the ideology or the doctrine, ideology in the sense of a doctor that wants to change the world, the progressive one that wants to establish the world on the basis of an idea. This is impossible in the modern world because we have rejected the foundations as meaningful, as intelligible, as nourishing and guiding, capable of guiding us in our everyday life. So what guides us is an impulse to violence, to object violently to another party. So you have to take a stance. You either take a stance of the dominant position or the objection. Now you can call this in different ways. It doesn't matter. You could even say that one is fascist, the other one is communist, or communist versus democratic, or despotic versus libertarian, and so forth. But the kernel of the predicament is the mechanical approach, closure to the fundamental questions. And so poetry opens up this scenario and says, well, we can fight, all right, we can fight, but what's the point? What's the point? Is the point just winning? Establish world peace here? Or is the point helping each other recognize the nature of the context in which we fight? So, you have this Sanskrit notion of samsara. So we're trapped in samsara. Samsara is Plato's cave. He says, well, it need not be that way. So we look at the foundations and we say, but this samsara is constituted this way and that way. And what are the fundamental drives of the life in samsara? This life of compulsion, this grasping, upadana, this vice, you could say. We're trapped in vice, fundamental problems, that are at the root of our present condition. Now, these fundamental problems are seen one way from our vantage point, and another way in themselves. So it may turn out that what we see as bad is ultimately good in itself. But we have no way of knowing as long as we don't let go of this mechanical perception of life and of war, of strife. So, well, we're told that it makes no sense to abandon it. But from the ancients, we learn that it is Mara, it is also, you could say, the snake in the garden is Satan, who tells us that there's no point seeking transcendence of violence. How do you escape violence? Well, there's no point. Well, why not look outward, beyond the battlefield? And the irony of our times is that we are told that it is dangerous to look outside. Just as we mock a certain discourse from the early modern period, or where people were told that if you go too far out into sea, you reach a point where you fall. So could we mock our present situation? We say, well, we live in such a climate of violence. And see, well, why not go out and say, well, it's dangerous. What do you mean it's dangerous? It is danger to remain within it, you could say, you could argue. But in fact, it's not dangerous to remain inside, you could also argue. It is quite safe. But the problem is that the safety is not solid. That the safety that the system provides is a narcotic. It is the safety that a jail, that a prison provides, or even worse, that a death row provides. What about the danger that is outside? To return to the pre-modern attitude would seem to mean returning to tribal warfare. And yet that is not really the case, because what we have today is tribal warfare mechanically conceived to progress into the establishment of world order, of a world peace. So we have a lot of violence today. Wherever you have a mechanical attitude towards the human being, we have violence. And yet, there's a sense in which we don't have to think about it, because we don't have to open up the old can of worms, the fundamental questions, remember? Exposure to them. That's dangerous. So we're safe with violence, and danger is out of the window. Danger is our enemy. Does that perhaps mean that danger is on the side of the opposite of violence? Is this where we stand today? Is danger the only genuine alternative to violence? Must we sacrifice our safety? I believe the Gospels have something to say about that. For the sake of facing what is hidden in danger. Must we face danger in order to discover the alternative to violence.